Welcome back to Goat Duels. I'm InfusionsCap, and today is episode 2 of Technical Support, Warriors. The most recent Premier level event was GFC 19, and this time around the last man standing when the dust cleared was none other than Jonathan LaBounty. Shoutouts to LaBounty for an impressive run, besting an unprecedented 232 player field. Before we get to the side, let's talk about a couple of noteworthy differences in the main deck from the last Warrior victory at a Premier level event. Right off the bat, the first thing to notice is that LaBounty elected to go down to 2 copies of Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, and instead played Magician of Faith in that open slot. This is interesting as a main deck choice, because it gives the opponent's otherwise dead copies of Nobleman of Crossout something they can hit. The benefits to this choice outweigh the risks in some ways, however, because Nobleman would take the opponent off of Magician of Faith as well. There's also the possibility of simply holding the Magician of Faith until the late game after the opponent has thrown their Noblemans out for Graceful Charity or Raigeki Break. With a copy of Magician in the deck, it gives the aggressive deck more reach in the late game to help against decks like Burn or in the Mirror Match. Chances are, most players weren't expecting this, and I think it paid off big dividends here. One other noteworthy thing in the main deck is the absence of the third Dust Tornado. LaBounty instead went with a main decked Book of Moon. I think this was a good call because Burn has been dwindling in popularity, and Book of Moon can be such a strong card against the likes of Thousand Eyes Restrict, which can pose a huge threat to aggressive strategies like Warriors. The One of Book also gives the main deck some counterplay in the presence of Royal Decree. Sure, it's only one card, but sometimes that's all you need to turn the tide, especially with a deck like this, which can apply pressure on the life points so quickly. The rest of the main deck looks pretty straightforward compared to what we've seen in other recent events, so let's move on to the side deck. The first thing to discuss here is the distribution with Mobius the Frost Monarch and Mystic Walk. As we discussed in previous videos and in the first episode of this series, single Mobius double walk has been a recurring trend in recent events. In this list, we see only one of each. Much like the removal of the third Dust Tornado in favor of Book of Moon, I think this was a meta call. LaBounty likely anticipated that Burn wouldn't be as big of a threat, so the spot that the second walk would normally occupy was available for something else. It goes deeper than that, though, and this is where I think the main deck Magician of Faith and the second Magician of Faith in the side deck came into play. Having access to Magician to recycle Walk, or something like Heavy Storm, gives you a huge edge against Burn, and I think that helps to ease some of the pressure on the side deck with slots dedicated to Burn by repurposing them into other cards that still work against Burn, but also affect other decks or help you in other matchups. Cliff the Trap Remover falls into this same bucket. It's good against Burn because it can attack under Floodgate cards like Level Limit Area B and Gravity Bind, but it also has a second purpose in helping against decks with Royal Decree. Plus it is of course searchable with Reinforcement of the Army. The only card in the side deck with a very narrow focus is Amazonas Archer. This card is a hard counter to Ojama Trio tokens. LaBounty likely chose this card over Hysteric Fairy because even though this is an Earth and Hysteric Fairy is a light with more attack points, Amazonas Archer is searchable by Rhoda, and the effect damage makes up for the difference in attack. Zombira the Dark in the side deck is obviously a beatdown choice for the mirror match and against Earth aggro decks, and potentially against decks reliant on hiding behind Gravekeeper Spy. Pretty standard to see one of these at this point, so let's move on. King Tiger Wanghu makes another appearance here, this time 2 copies instead of 3. There are arguments for 3 being the right number, and there are arguments for 2 being the right number. At the end of the day, I think it depends on the rest of your list as to whether or not you would need the third copy. Since this main deck and the rest of the side has good coverage against Burn and Control, which are arguably the 2 hardest matchups for Warriors, it makes sense that this particular list can get away with only 2 copies. The biggest sacrifice to playing 2 instead of 3 in my mind is that it gives you 1 less Wanghu to open with to stop decks like Reasoning Gate from using Scapegoat, but even still, 2 Wanghus takes the day this time. Speaking of other cards that are good in multiple matchups, let's talk about Xing Zhenhu. This card is really picking up traction in the community, and it's not hard to see why. It's strong in the mirror, strong against Burn, and can even be used against any control deck that isn't going with the Royal Decree approach. Not much else to say about it. It's good against anything backfield heavy, and the meta has a sizable amount of that right now. Swords of Revealing Light is another card that's fairly straightforward to see in Warrior sides these days. It's good against any aggressive deck like the Mirror or Earth Aggro, and can even be used against control decks, especially if they have Decree and you need to put spells in your deck in favor of traps. You can use this against decks like Reasoning Gate as well, but it isn't nearly as effective due to the multitude of giant Trunades they have access to. It may still be better than some of the stuff you would take out though, so it's more like a flex slot for a slight upgrade in those matchups. The single mind control on the side isn't too surprising. Some warrior lists may even go so far as to side 2 of these, but I think that's a bit overkill. The best thing the warrior deck has going for it in this meta is how strong it can be against Chaos Turbo. Notice there aren't too many cards in the side deck for the Turbo matchup, and that's because the matchup is already favorable for the warrior deck. I'm personally not a fan of mind control in the warrior deck, but I wouldn't consider it incorrect to include it if it fits your playstyle and works with the rest of your list. Including Magician of Faith in the list can also help this card to compound value. The second Book of Moon in the side is another solid choice. Like I said earlier, it's good against Thousand Eyes decks or decks with Decree, since it gives you a spell you can defend with instead of having to be all in on your traps for defense. Worth noting, another advantage to Magician of Faith in this version of the deck is the synergy it has with Book of Moon. Pretty basic, but important to consider. Book also combos well with the 2 copies of Spirit Reaper in the side deck. This can be a good card in the mirror or against other aggressive decks like Earth Aggro. It can also be used as a wall against decks like Reasoning Gate. It's also a decent card against control decks because it makes it hard for them to push damage through it if Restrict makes it into play, unless they have the combo with Tsukiyomi. It can help float a body to tribute summon Mobius as well, so if Mobius is coming in, one or both of the Reapers can as well. Also pairing well with Mobius, the last card in the side deck, Brain Control. Not only can Brain Control help you tribute summon, it can be used to clear GK Spy if your opponent leaves 2 in attack mode. You can use it in the mirror or against Earth Aggro to help simplify the board state while pushing damage, and you can even use it against Monarch decks to help push big chunks of damage after they play a tribute monster. It's a pretty versatile card, and it's hard to nail down a specific matchup outside of aggro mirrors where this would come in. It's just a good option to have. There are a few alternatives we can discuss on this one. Let's start with a couple of monsters, Berserk Gorilla and Kinetic Soldier, aka Cypher Soldier. While both of these are good cards and aren't really bad choices, Zombira tends to be the best anti-beatdown monster for this deck. In the last video, I said Berserk Gorilla was the best for Turbo because it's the most flexible, and while it is still more flexible than Zombira in this deck, Zombira tends to be better for a number of reasons. For starters, it's dark. 2100 attack can help you better against other beatdown monsters in the mirror, but it's also something that can get over Gigantes in the Earth Aggro match. It can even help chip away at GK Spy walls, and Spy is one of the bigger issues for this deck because it helps the opponent buy time. Not to mention Zombira is searchable by Reinforcement of the Army, which is a pretty big deal. The fact that Zombira can't attack directly isn't usually a big problem for this deck because the Warrior package has so many other monsters already available to it that can push massive direct damage. You just don't really run into an issue of not having something to beat down with. Another thing I see cited for aggro decks is Widespread Ruin. Again, I don't think this is necessarily bad, but given the number of defensive options this list already had available and the way LaBounty was able to manage the spread between monsters, spells, and traps, I can see why he opted to play more proactive cards in the mirror match like Zombira and Brain Control instead of another slow trap card like Widespread. A couple of other cards we sometimes see are additional side deck copies to round out playsets if they aren't mained, such as the third Kaiku or the third Trap Dust Shoot. With this list, LaBounty decided to main 2 each of those and not side the third copy on either. I think this was fine to do so because both of these cards tend to be their best against Turbo, moderate to weak in the mirror, and fairly average to slightly above average against control decks. Since this deck has a natural advantage against Turbo, it makes sense that some of those options would be trimmed down to make neutral and tougher matchups a little bit easier and to make space for other side deck options that can tip the scales where you need it most. Similarly, the third Dust Tornado was not sided either, but I think that was more of a meta call for this particular event. Plus the copy of Xing Zhen Hu tends to fill a similar role, sometimes doing it better. The only place where Xing is more likely to be weak is against something like Level Limit Area B or some other continuous card that has already been activated. There are a handful of other cards you can consider on the Warrior side as well, such as Smashing Ground, My Body as a Shield, Asura Priest, or Gravekeeper Spy. The deck is honestly pretty flexible, and while I think these cards tend to be a bit weaker at the moment, they do still have their purposes. It really just depends on what you think the meta would be for the event you're going to. Asura Priest can be a good option if you expect a lot of scapegoat-based decks like Control or Reasoning Gate, but tends to be a bit awkward sometimes due to the effect of returning to your hand. It can make it hard to tempo out and take advantage of the deck's biggest strength sometimes. Smashing Ground can be good at dealing with Thousand Eyes or big monsters like a Monarch, or even helping out against a wall of GK Spies. My Body can act like an additional Solemn, helping you protect pushes, but it has a steep cost, especially if you keep Solemns in the deck when you use it. Spy can help wall out against other aggro decks and provide tribute fodder for something like Mobius, but of course it has its own downsides in this type of deck. It really just depends on how you want to play the deck and what you expect the field to be, so play around and experiment with it. After all, it is a game, and it's about trying new ideas and having fun. Before we wrap up the video, let's talk a little bit about what we would side out in some of the various matchups, starting with Turbo. Since Warriors are generally favored against Turbo, this is the most straightforward of the decks to look at. Nothing in the main deck is really dead against them, but there are a few lackluster cards that you can swap for stronger options. If you are siding extra copies of Kaiku and Dust Shoot, this is the matchup for them. With this particular list, Mind Control would come in for sure. The second Magician of Faith is a possible inclusion, as is Zombira the Dark, since it's a big monster to beat their beaters like Kaiku and help clear out GK Spy Walls. Dust Tornado is a card you can consider cutting, but I tend to like it in this matchup. Turbo doesn't play a ton of traps, but being able to catch them in the end phase, especially against versions of Turbo that are using Solemn Judgment, can be a big advantage. The weakest cards in this matchup are probably the Sakus. Turbo doesn't have a lot of ways to try to win the board with attacks outside of their Chaos monsters, which they usually won't attack with unless they have a way to protect the push. Book of Moon isn't super strong against them, but I think it's better than Saku, especially in this list because it can recycle Magician of Faith, and it always helps to protect your monsters against Snatch Steal, and make your Mystic level 2 live against bigger monsters. You can make a case for cutting Don Zalug in this matchup if you bring in Zombira so that you still have a searchable Dark for Rhoda, because the opponent is likely to have Thunder Dragons and Sinister Serpent to guard their hand against Don, but he's still a viable option as well, so dropping him is optional, even if Zombira comes in. In the mirror match, the most obvious cuts are Nobleman of Crossout, Mystic Swordsman level 2, and Trap Dust Shoot. You can make a case for cutting some quantity of Kaiku as well, but that depends on what else you're bringing in and how many beatdown monsters that will leave you with. Kaiku's still reasonable, but easier to out after siding. This is where you want to bring in Zombira and things like Berserk Gorilla and Kinetic Soldier if you're playing them. Brain Control is good in the mirror for aggressive pushes, and Swords is good for buying you time. Xing Zhen Hu is a strong option in the mirror because they're so heavy on backfield. Book of Moon isn't a bad choice, but it's not the strongest either, since it usually ends up being a -1 in a War of Attrition unless you have something to destroy the monster you booked. It does help you against Snatch Steal though, and Brain Control if they bring that in. You can make a case for the second Magician here, and the Spirit Reapers' defensive and utility options are a possibility as well, especially since they're likely to remove their Noblemans and Swordsmans also. Some players even take out their one-of Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke in the mirror, but I think that's a mistake since some warrior decks are starting to utilize GK Spy as a way to facilitate Mobius, which is also a possible addition for the matchup, plus cutting Sasuke eats into your light count. The plan against Earth aggro is pretty similar with a few small changes. Zombira and Berserk Gorilla are still good, but Kinetic Soldier isn't. Nobleman is a little better to keep against Earth aggro since they use Battle Searchers like Giant Rat, but it's still kind of iffy. Mystic Swordsman level 2 is still weak. Dust Shoot's a little better than it is against Warriors, but you're not required to keep it. If I'm playing second, I tend to cut them in favor of more live draws, but if I'm going first, I'm more likely to consider keeping them in. Brain Control, Swords, Xing, and possibly Mobius are all still good options to bring in against Earth aggro. For the burn matchup, you want Amazoness Archer, or Hysteric Fairy if you choose to go that route, King Tiger Wanghu, Xing Zhen Hu, Mobius the Frost Monarch, Mystic Wok, the additional Magician, and Cliff the Trap Remover. Tiger and Archer are your outs to Ojama token locks. Cliff removes floodgates and can attack under them. Mobius is obviously a powerhouse here, and Magician lets you reuse critical spells. This is a tough deck to side against because most of the cards you could consider as cuts aren't really dead, but they don't tend to have the most impact. Sakuretsu Armor is a good example of this. It can help against Panda, but short of Panda and Fairy Lily and the occasional poke with Giant Rat, this deck doesn't do much attacking, so some quantity of those could be loose. Kaiku isn't super strong against burn decks either, since they aren't worried about a Chaos Summon. He really just ends up being a subpar beater. I think it's risky to cut Ninja Grandmaster, as he can help you against defensive walls that they may side in. This may be an unpopular opinion, but I actually think Blade Knight is somewhat weak against burn. I wouldn't cut all of them because you do have to still consider Morphing Jar and Cyber Jar, and if burn gets to resolve those, the game is pretty much over. But I do think you can get away with cutting one. Another card that isn't dead against burn but ends up being really slow is Snatch Steal, so I tend to consider siding that out as well. Trap Dish Shoot isn't really strong against burn either, but I can see a case for it if you're going first and if you just really want the information that badly. Donzalug is kind of iffy as well. He isn't really big enough to get through, and Panda Burn tends to sell a lot of cards anyway, keeping their hand count low. Solemn is obviously dangerous against burn, and I would recommend dropping some, if not all of them. It's the kind of card where if you knew you wouldn't draw them until the late game, it would still be super powerful, but seeing them early against burn is just a recipe for disaster and can put you in tough spots. The same can be said for Ring of Destruction and even Delinquent Duo and Premature Burial, as any life point payment against burn must be taken seriously. Due to the nature of the burn deck, I think Duo is actually quite ineffective against them after turn 1, and should probably be viewed the same way Dust Shoot is in this matchup. Ring can clear Ojama tokens and give you board space to make plays, but aside from that, it's pretty risky in the matchup. Premature is worth it in my opinion, since you can get so much value out of Exiled Forest, Mystic Level 2, Cliff, Wanghu, and Tribe in this matchup. At the end of the day, the best way to determine how to side out for burn should be based on the individual tech choices and who's going first. But all of those things that I named are the cards you're most likely going to want to consider. Control decks are tough to side against as well, because there's so many variations on them. You essentially have two versions of control to consider, the traditional Goat control decks and the Thunder Dragon control decks with extra Chaos monsters. Within those two umbrellas, there also exists the Decree paradox, as both variations could play it or could choose not to play it. Control, much like Turbo, can be teched out in many other ways as well, and can make use of tons of combo options. Since there's so many variants and it's difficult to map this, let's look at some generic thoughts. For any version, you're likely to want the second Book of Moon and the additional Magician of Faith. Book is strong against Thousand Eyes no matter what version of Control they're playing, and Magician recycling power spells is almost universally good. King Tiger is also good against basically every version because they're all going to be using Scapegoat. Some of the more matchup dependent cards you can consider are Spirit Reaper, Swords, Mobius, and Cliff. If the opponent is on a Royal Decree variant, then you're more than likely going to want to consider Cliff and Mobius. If they aren't playing Decree, then Cliff doesn't really get much mileage, and Mobius is kind of optional at that point. If they aren't playing Decree, you can also consider Xing Zhen Hu, but I wouldn't say it's required either. If you're playing a version of Warriors that sides Asura Priest, then this is the matchup for that as well. The cuts are the hardest part for these matchups. The easy answer in regards to the Decree variants is to cut traps to lower your weakness to Decree, but keep in mind that cutting traps and filling the deck up with monsters when you only get one normal summon a turn has its own set of problems. On the trap side, however, some quantity of Sakuretsu could be looked at as potential cuts, especially against Decree variants. I think Dust Tornado is actually pretty good against Control since it gives you the chance to snipe the Decree before it's activated, or get rid of it in a chain in response to one of your other traps being used. In spite of that, if you need to make additional trap cuts beyond Sakuretsu, then Solemn, Dust Tornado, and Trap Dust Shoot are going to be where you want to look. I think the power trap trinity of Mirror Force, Torrential, and Ring are still too good in this matchup to cut any of them, and Call is strong as well, especially since you're going to be adding more monsters into the deck. As for monsters you can cut to make space for others, the weakest against the control decks tends to be Donzalug. If your opponent isn't playing GK Spy, which a lot of control decks don't since it can be awkward with Scapegoat, then you can make a case for cutting Ninja Grandmaster as well. The traditional Goat control decks usually only play BLS and no sorcerers, so you have some freedom to fluctuate your count on Kaiku as well, but keep in mind that Metamorphosis on Sinister is a common play, and being able to find an opening to eat Sinister with Kaiku can go a long way in the matchup, so you will want to consider that as well. Blade Knight's pretty good against control because they try to index pretty heavily on Magician of Faith and other advantage cards like Dekoichi and Magical Merchant, so the ability to hinder flip effects can go a long way. That being said, you may not be boxed into keeping all three. If you need a slot, you can potentially go down to two. DD Warrior Lady is also a consideration because of how the matches tend to play out against control decks, but if your opponent sides in big monsters like Mobius or Genzo, or walls like Spirit Reaper, it can be a nice tool to still have, and it punishes reckless sets of Sinister Serpent. Much like with Ninja Grandmaster, I tend to keep this in for utility purposes, but it can be a consideration. And finally, let's talk about Reasoning Gate. The game plan against this deck should be to push damage faster than they can go off, and use cards like Kaiku and King Tiger to slow them down further. If you are siding Asura Priest, you can bring it in for this matchup as well as another way to clear scapegoat walls. Brain Control works fairly well against this deck as a way to help aggressive pushes and win in a scenario where you're basically trying to race each other down. If you are siding Berserk Gorilla, it tends to do well here as just another way to push more damage. This is also a good matchup for bringing in Spirit Reaper as a stall tactic. You can make a case for swords and the additional Book of Moon, but you have to keep in mind the opponent is going to have Heavy Storm and 3 Giant Trunade in their deck as well. The additional Magician can be slow, but the utility it can provide could be worth it. For cards to cut, Nobleman's really weak here, as is Mystic Swordsman level 2. Trap Dust Shoot is iffy. It does give information, but oftentimes you would prefer the monsters just be in their hand. It's not wrong to keep it, but you do have the option to cut it. Dust Tornado, Mystical Space, and Heavy Storm are somewhat weak, as the deck plays virtually no backfield cards other than Scapegoat and potentially Mirror Force, Torrential, and Ring. I actually like keeping MST in this matchup for in-phase catches on Scapegoat and for protection against Snatch Steal. I actually think MST and Dust are potentially stronger than Heavy Storm against this deck, as crazy as that sounds. I also don't like keeping Delinquent in against this deck all of the time. If they're playing a variant with 2 to 3 sorcerers, you may end up helping them more than you hurt them if you play duo. For the same reason, Donzaloo can be removed in favor of something else. If they're on a version of the deck that plays Aeronite, they will likely side it out after game 1 because of how poorly it does against warrior decks, but if they keep it in, you could consider Zombira as another quick answer to it in game 3. Book tends to be average against them, aside from potentially putting Genzo face down to activate your traps again. Otherwise, it's just another card that may get value but is likely susceptible to Giant Trunade, so you can consider flexing that out for something else as well. Call and Premature are somewhat slow against this deck, especially Call. I think you can consider taking Call out, but I would leave Premature since it's faster to activate and can combo easily with something you discard to Graceful Charity. Thank you for watching. I hope this gives you some clarity on the options available to the Warrior deck. And congrats again to Jonathan LaBounty for his win at GF19 with a solid Warrior list. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more GOAT format content and future videos in this series. And until next time, duel well and duel often.